when 68-year-old Robert Thompson shot his granddaughter's abusive boyfriend, nobody expected what would be revealed in the courtroom 3 months later. The incident on Maple Street seemed like a straightforward case of domestic violence escalating into tragedy, with an elderly grandfather making a desperate decision to protect his family from an increasingly dangerous situation. Neighbors who witnessed the aftermath described Robert as a quiet, unassuming retiree who kept to himself and spent most of his time tending his small garden behind the modest two-story house where he had lived with his granddaughter Emily for the past 2 years. Police reports documented the shooting as self-defense during a domestic dispute, and initial court proceedings suggested that Robert would face minimal charges given his age and the circumstances surrounding his actions. But what the prosecution, defense attorneys, and even Robert's own family couldn't have known was that routine background checks would trigger a series of events that would transform a local domestic violence case into something that would capture national attention and reveal secrets that had been classified at the highest levels of government for over 4 decades. The relationship between Emily Thompson and Marcus Webb had been deteriorating for months before the night that would change everything for the Thompson family. Emily, a 22-year-old nursing student at the local community college, had met Marcus through friends at a party 6 months earlier, drawn to his charm and apparent confidence that initially masked deeper problems with anger and control. Robert had noticed troubling changes in his granddaughter's behavior as the relationship progressed, observing that Emily became increasingly withdrawn and anxious, making excuses for missed family dinners and avoiding conversations about her personal life. Marcus's visits to the Thompson home grew more frequent and more volatile, with raised voices echoing through the house during arguments that Emily always dismissed as normal relationship stress when Robert expressed his concerns. The bruises that began appearing on Emily's arms and shoulders were explained away as accidents from her nursing clinical rotations, but Robert's military-trained observation skills recognized the patterns of domestic abuse even when his granddaughter couldn't acknowledge them herself. But what Emily couldn't have understood was that her grandfather's growing concern wasn't just based on parental instincts, and his careful documentation of Marcus's behavior reflected training that had been acquired through experiences far more dangerous than civilian life had prepared her to recognize. The escalation that led to the shooting began when Marcus arrived at the Thompson house, intoxicated and agitated on a Tuesday evening in late October. Emily had been studying for midterm examinations when Marcus burst through the front door without knocking, immediately demanding to know why she hadn't answered his phone calls from earlier that afternoon. Robert heard the commotion from his bedroom upstairs and quietly positioned himself at the top of the staircase where he could observe the interaction while remaining out of sight, a tactical advantage that allowed him to assess the threat level without escalating the situation through his presence. Marcus's accusations became increasingly irrational as he accused Emily of cheating, ignoring him, and planning to leave him, despite her attempts to calm him down and explain that she had been studying with her phone on silent mode. When Emily tried to walk away from the argument, Marcus grabbed her arm with enough force to spin her around, causing her to cry out in pain, and triggering Robert's immediate intervention as he descended the stairs with deliberate calm that concealed his tactical assessment of the situation. But what Marcus couldn't have realized was that his aggressive behavior toward Emily had activated protective instincts in Robert that had been forged through decades of training designed to neutralize threats with precision and efficiency that civilian self-defense situations rarely required. Robert's initial attempt to de-escalate the situation involved positioning himself between Marcus and Emily while speaking in calm, measured tones that demonstrated his experience in managing volatile confrontations. Marcus responded to Robert's intervention with increased aggression, turning his anger toward the elderly man and shouting profanities while advancing in a threatening manner that suggested his intoxication had impaired his judgment about the potential consequences of his actions. Robert maintained his defensive position while instructing Emily to call 911, but Marcus interpreted this as an escalation and responded by pushing Robert backward while threatening to hurt both him and Emily if they didn't stop interfering with his relationship. The physical contact triggered Robert's defensive training as he recognized that Marcus's size, age, and intoxicated state made him a legitimate threat to both his own safety and Emily's well-being, requiring a response that would neutralize the danger before it could escalate further. When Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and threatened to use what he claimed was a weapon, Robert made the split-second decision that would later be analyzed by military psychologists, legal experts, and ultimately reveal the true nature of his background through proceedings that no one could have anticipated. The shooting occurred at 9:47 p.m. when Robert retrieved his legally owned pistol from a secure location and fired 2 shots that struck Marcus in the chest, immediately incapacitating him and ending the immediate threat to Emily's safety. Robert's actions following the shooting demonstrated training that exceeded typical civilian firearm instruction, as he secured the weapon, checked Marcus's vital signs, and began administering first aid while Emily called for emergency medical assistance. Responding paramedics found Marcus unconscious but alive, though his injuries would prove fatal during emergency surgery at the Regional Medical Center 3 hours later. Police officers who arrived at the scene noted Robert's calm demeanor and precise account of the events, observing that his description of the incident included tactical details that seemed unusual for a civilian retiree who claimed no special training beyond basic firearm safety courses. Robert was arrested and charged with second-degree murder pending investigation, though his attorney immediately filed for bail, arguing that the shooting represented legitimate self-defense during a home invasion by an individual with a documented history of domestic violence. But what investigating officers couldn't have known was that Robert's behavior and responses during questioning reflected training that had been classified for decades, and his background would soon trigger attention from federal agencies whose interest would transform the case from local criminal proceedings into something involving national security considerations. The initial court proceedings began 3 weeks after the shooting, with Robert posting bail and returning to his home to care for Emily, who struggled with guilt over her grandfather's situation, despite understanding that Marcus's death had likely saved her from escalating abuse. Robert's defense attorney, Patricia Morris, built her case around self-defense and protection of family, presenting evidence of Marcus's history of domestic violence and arguing that Robert's actions were those of a concerned grandfather protecting his granddaughter from imminent harm. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Crawford, acknowledged the domestic violence context, but argued that Robert's use of lethal force was excessive given his age and Marcus's intoxication, suggesting that less lethal alternatives could have resolved the situation without resulting in death. Pretrial hearings focused on Robert's mental state, his relationship with Emily, and the circumstances surrounding Marcus's increasingly violent behavior, with both sides presenting expert testimony about domestic violence patterns and appropriate defensive responses. But what neither the prosecution nor the defense could have anticipated was that routine background verification procedures would reveal information that would fundamentally alter the nature of the case and require security clearances for attorneys who had been handling what they assumed was a straightforward domestic violence defense. The revelation that would change everything began when court clerks processed Robert's background information through standard databases used for criminal proceedings, triggering automated alerts that reached federal agencies responsible for monitoring individuals whose service records involved classified operations. Robert's fingerprints matched files that had been sealed for over 40 years, identifying him as Colonel Robert Thompson, former commander of special operations units whose missions had remained classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. Military personnel records revealed that Robert had served 3 tours in Vietnam, conducting operations that would never appear in official histories, followed by assignments in Central America and the Middle East that involved activities too sensitive for conventional military documentation. His service record included commendations for operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, rescued American hostages, and eliminated threats to national security through methods that required complete deniability to protect ongoing intelligence operations and diplomatic relationships. But what court officials couldn't have understood was that Robert's true military background involved training and experience that made his response to Marcus's threat far more significant than a simple case of self-defense, and his identity would soon attract attention from officials whose involvement would transform local criminal proceedings into matters requiring federal oversight. The federal intervention began when Pentagon officials contacted the local court system to inform them that Robert Thompson's case involved classified information that required special handling to protect national security interests. Military attorneys arrived to consult with both prosecution and defense teams, explaining that Robert's service record included operations so sensitive that details could not be disclosed in open court without compromising ongoing security operations and the safety of personnel still involved in classified activities. Judge Margaret Sullivan, who had been appointed to oversee the case, found herself managing proceedings that required security clearances for court staff and limitations on public access to documents that might reveal classified information about Robert's military background. The defense strategy shifted dramatically when Patricia Morris learned that her client's true identity provided justification for his actions that extended far beyond civilian self-defense standards. While the prosecution realized that pursuing charges against a decorated war hero would require navigating federal restrictions on classified evidence. But what the legal teams couldn't have anticipated was that Robert's military record would attract attention from senior government officials whose involvement would ultimately determine whether justice could be served while protecting secrets that had been guarded for decades. The courtroom transformation became evident when federal security personnel established protocols that treated Robert's trial as a matter involving national security rather than simple criminal proceedings. Spectator access was limited, media coverage was restricted, and court documents were classified to prevent disclosure of information that might compromise ongoing military operations or reveal details about Robert's previous assignments. Expert witnesses included retired military officers who testified about the training and experience that shaped Robert's response to threats, explaining that his actions during the domestic violence incident reflected tactical decision-making that had been developed through years of high-stakes operations where split-second choices determined life or death outcomes. Robert's defense team presented evidence that his shooting of Marcus demonstrated restraint and precision that prevented harm to Emily while neutralizing a legitimate threat, arguing that his military training had actually minimized violence by ending the confrontation quickly and efficiently. But what observers in the courtroom couldn't have known was that the testimony they were hearing represented only a fraction of Robert's true service record, and the classified operations that had shaped his training would remain secret even as they provided context for understanding his actions during what appeared to be a routine domestic violence incident. The revelation of Robert's military identity had profound effects on Emily, who struggled to reconcile the quiet grandfather she had known with the decorated war hero whose service record was being discussed in federal security briefings. Robert had deliberately concealed his military background to protect his family from potential threats and to maintain the peaceful retirement he had earned through decades of dangerous service, believing that his granddaughter deserved a normal life free from the shadows that had defined his career. Emily's testimony about her relationship with Robert provided insight into the man behind the classified operations, describing a grandfather who had been patient, supportive, and protective throughout her childhood and adolescence, without ever indicating the true nature of his background or capabilities. Her account of Marcus's escalating abuse and her grandfather's growing concern demonstrated that Robert's intervention had been motivated by family loyalty rather than military training, though his response had inevitably reflected skills that most civilians would never possess. But what Emily couldn't have understood was that her grandfather's decision to use lethal force had been informed by experience that enabled him to recognize threat levels and respond with precision that civilian self-defense training could never provide, making his actions both more justified and more complex than typical domestic violence cases required courts to evaluate. The prosecution's case collapsed when District Attorney Crawford realized that pursuing charges against Robert Thompson would require challenging the judgment of a decorated war hero whose service record demonstrated decades of making life or death decisions under extreme pressure. Federal officials made it clear that Robert's military background provided context that justified his actions while protecting information that could not be disclosed without compromising national security interests. Expert testimony established that Robert's training had actually prevented greater violence by enabling him to neutralize Marcus's threat quickly and efficiently, minimizing risk to Emily and avoiding the prolonged confrontation that might have resulted from less decisive action. The judge acknowledged that Robert's military experience provided justification for his response that exceeded civilian self-defense standards, recognizing that his training had been designed to protect others through methods that reflected years of experience in situations where failure meant death for American personnel and civilians. But what legal experts couldn't have anticipated was that Robert's case would establish precedents for how courts should evaluate self-defense actions taken by individuals whose classified military training provided capabilities that extended far beyond civilian expectations. The final court proceedings took place in a secure courtroom with limited access and restricted media coverage that protected classified information while allowing justice to be served through recognition of Robert's legitimate self-defense actions. Judge Sullivan dismissed all charges against Robert Thompson, acknowledging that his military training provided both justification and context for his response to Marcus's threat, while recognizing that his actions had protected Emily from escalating domestic violence that could have resulted in her serious injury or death. Robert's defense attorney expressed gratitude for the outcome, while noting that the case had revealed the challenges faced by veterans whose classified service complicated their civilian lives and legal proceedings. The prosecution accepted the dismissal as appropriate given the circumstances and Robert's background, acknowledging that pursuing charges would have been inappropriate considering his military service and the legitimate threat posed by Marcus's violent behavior. But what participants in the legal proceedings couldn't have fully understood was that Robert's case had exposed broader issues about how society supports veterans whose classified service requires them to conceal their true backgrounds while adapting to civilian life that rarely acknowledges the sacrifices they have made to protect national security. The aftermath of Robert Thompson's trial had lasting effects on both his family and the legal system's understanding of how military training affects civilian self-defense situations. Emily gained new appreciation for her grandfather's background while struggling to process the knowledge that his quiet retirement had concealed decades of service that she could never fully understand due to classification requirements. Robert returned to his peaceful life while maintaining the security protocols that protected information about his military career. But his case had attracted attention that would require ongoing vigilance to ensure that his family remained safe from potential threats associated with his previous assignments. Legal experts began studying the case as an example of how courts should evaluate self-defense actions taken by individuals whose military training provided capabilities that exceeded civilian standards, recognizing that veterans' backgrounds required special consideration during criminal proceedings. But what the broader community couldn't have realized was that Robert's story represented thousands of veterans whose classified service required them to conceal their true backgrounds while adapting to civilian life, that rarely acknowledged the skills and sacrifices that had been required to protect American interests around the world. 6 months after the charges were dismissed, Robert Thompson continued living quietly with Emily, who had graduated from nursing school and begun working at the regional medical center where she specialized in trauma care that reflected her own understanding of violence and recovery. Robert's military decorations remained in a secure display case that honored his service while protecting the classified nature of his assignments, and his relationship with Emily had grown stronger through their shared experience of navigating the legal system and processing the truth about his background. The community's perception of Robert had changed from seeing him as a quiet retiree to recognizing him as a decorated veteran whose presence provided security and stability that most civilians took for granted. His case had influenced local law enforcement training and legal education about how military backgrounds affect civilian situations, ensuring that future cases involving veterans would receive appropriate consideration for their specialized training and experience. But what observers of Robert's transformation couldn't have known was that his story illustrated the ongoing challenges faced by veterans whose service required them to balance their protective instincts with civilian expectations, using skills that had been acquired through experiences that society preferred to remain hidden while benefiting from the security that such service provided. This incredible story of hidden military service and family protection demonstrates how classified backgrounds can remain concealed until circumstances force them into public attention, revealing that ordinary community members may possess extraordinary capabilities acquired through service that most Americans will never fully understand. If you enjoyed discovering how a grandfather's quiet retirement concealed decades of classified military operations that ultimately justified his protection of his granddaughter from domestic violence, make sure to subscribe to Untold Legends Stories and hit that notification bell to never miss our daily uploads. We publish new stories every day featuring amazing tales of hidden heroes whose sacrifices protect our freedom in ways we never realize. Hit the like button if this story touched you, and leave a comment telling us what you thought about Robert's remarkable revelation and how his military background influenced his response to protecting Emily. Let us know if you've ever wondered about the stories behind quiet community members whose backgrounds might include experiences too classified to discuss but too important to forget. Your likes, comments, and engagement help us continue bringing you these incredible tales of people who serve our country through sacrifices that remain forever hidden until circumstances reveal their true dedication to protecting others. Tomorrow, we'll share another amazing story that proves heroism often hides behind the most ordinary appearances.